Well, thank you and good evening. I was asked to speak about river dynamics and floodplains. I've kind of morphed that into a talk on managing dynamic rivers, which I understand the committee is at least partly responsible for doing that. So hopefully this will hit home in some ways. I've been working on rivers for 40 plus years now, through college, then as a university professor, and now for more than 20 years as a consultant. Have done work in 18 states and 12 countries around the world. I guess that makes me a bit of an expert on rivers, but I will say it does not make me an expert on the trout and Missisquoi rivers. So I'll say some things about the watershed, and I'll let you, who might be more of an expert on that area, sort of chime in and correct me where I might be wrong in some of my readings of aerial photographs and topographic maps. Rivers are dynamic, which basically means they tend to move around. This is a map of the lower Mississippi River showing how the river channel has migrated over hundreds of years. The river position has changed, but that meandering planform has remained consistent through that time. The same can be said of the Trout River, where the meanders are moving and migrating over a much shorter time scale in this series of aerial photographs. But similarly, the meandering planform seems relatively consistent, although some changes in shape and certainly changes in position. This dynamic nature of rivers doesn't really cause any problems, if you will, until it starts interacting with infrastructure, roads, and other valuable resources. And the same can be said on the Trout River, where over a 25-year period, this meander bend has migrated 150 feet. But other than perhaps the landowner, there probably wasn't much concern until it reached the road just a few years ago. And you can see in the bottom photo the excavator at work laying riprap out on the riverbank to protect the road. So this brings up a few questions I'd like to talk about tonight. What causes rivers to be dynamic? How can we identify the most dynamic areas along a river, sort of thinking ahead as river managers, trying to anticipate perhaps where problems could be faced rather than knee-jerk reactions once the problem has arisen? And then realizing that rivers are dynamic, how can we manage rivers in a manner consistent with that sort of natural dynamic nature of rivers? Let's attack that first question first. What causes rivers to be dynamic? That can be easily answered with one parable of river processes I like to talk about, which is flowing water carries sediment. Everything else follows from that simple idea. Even just a little trickle of meltwater across a road can move a little bit of sediment. Rivers are moving a great deal more of sediment because they have a great deal more of flow. If we look at a river, though, we're normally thinking about the water that's flowing down the river, and that water flows fairly consistently, might get caught up in an eddy for a while, but a single molecule of water is going to round this bend without too much trouble and make its way out to the end of the river in a matter of days, or even hours, perhaps. But sediment is a different story. That sediment doesn't move consistently around the river bend. Some of it gets caught up on a point bar where that river flow is much slower and is deposited, whereas some new sediment is picked up on the outer bend. We call a river stable if the amount of sediment moving through the reach is relatively equal. Might not be the same sand grain, but the same sort of volume of sediment might be moving around the bend over time, although certain sand grains might stay on that bar for decades or centuries. Now, that sediment movement is not consistent everywhere. If we look at the area of the Trout River near Montgomery Center, you can see in the upper right part of the photograph, there's very little sediment accumulating through Montgomery Center. But as we get downstream, you'll see this white tone is all of the sediment that's accumulating in the river. That distribution of sediment is uneven. Now, there's several reasons for that. One of them can be completely natural, which is the case in Montgomery Center area. But I'll give you a much more dramatic example from halfway around the world in Bhutan, where in the Himalaya mountains here in the deep, steep canyons, there's a lot of power in the water to move the sediment. And so you don't get much sediment accumulation in the canyons. But as those canyons start opening up at the end of the mountains, as you enter the great sort of plains of India at the southern border of Bhutan, we have a great deal of sediment accumulating on the river, spreading out across the entire valley bottom. Another reason, though, that sediment transport might be sort of discontinuous, not sort of an equal amount of sediment everywhere, might be due to human alterations of the channel. And one of the great alterations of the channel, of channels, rivers, and streams throughout New England is artificial channel straightening. And the big reason for that straightening, sort of the major cause of that straightening, was the log drives, primarily in the 19th century, but beginning even into the even early, at least in Maine in the 1600s, even up the Connecticut River in the 1600s, and continuing well into the 20th century. But a lot of this major channel alteration was probably occurring in the 19th century. This channel straightening, you can see it everywhere in New England. In this example from the White River, we can see 3 hallmarks of straightening that you can pick up on topographic maps. So the first one is we can see sort of a natural meander dimension here, but downstream you'll see there's a long straight stretch with no meanders, even though about 3 of these meanders could fit in this section of river across the floodplain here. The fact that those meanders are missing despite a floodplain across which they could form is a strong indication the river's been straightened. Another telltale sign of this straightening is often these straightened channels are plastered up against one of the valley sides. We can see the steep mountain side here and the floodplain across here. The river is suspiciously up against the mountain side, whereas naturally we would expect the river to flow anywhere across the floodplain. So that's a second hallmark of the straightening. A third hallmark of the straightening is sometimes you can see the old meanders which were abandoned when the river was straightened. And here we can see that in the form of a tributary sort of flowing in the old meanders that were probably there prior to the straightening. Logs move easier down straightened rivers than around all those bends, so it made sense for the log drivers to straighten the river channels. But that straightened configuration remains in many places around New England. And all you really need is one of these hallmarks to sort of identify that straightening. Such is the case on the Missisquoi and Trout rivers. Here on the Trout River, we can see the portion of the channel up against the valley side. Even here where the valley side isn't straight, you can see the channel sort of follows closely the valley side. Then on the Missisquoi River up above the confluence with the Trout River, we can see the river up against the valley side. If it was naturally formed, we'd expect it to be anywhere across the floodplain. So what are the implications of this straightening? Well, one of the implications is a habitat implication. Straightened rivers are steeper. We've sort of taken out some of the length of the meanders, so these rivers have more energy. They can more easily move sediment, so all the point bars are washed out, the pools are washed out, and even the riverbanks are eroding and widening. And so what we end up with in the summertime is very shallow flows, no point bars to sort of contain the river into a narrower area. And so the rivers are quite wide and warm easily in the summer, very little flow complexity. We can see this, the one ground photograph I could find from the south branch of the Trout River, we see something very similar, sort of over widened stream channel, maybe some shading, but maybe not across the entire channel. Very little pools, very little flow complexity, important for aquatic habitat. Now, we've grown up with these straightened rivers. When you look at a photograph here of the Sawmill River, artificially straightened decades ago, if not more than a century ago, uh, we see an idyllic river. In fact, these straightened rivers are so scenic and idyllic that one of these straightened channels made the cover of the Wild and Scenic River Study Report for the Upper Missisquoi and Trout Rivers. But you will notice the absence of sandbars, and it's probably very shallow here. And so this is efficiently moving sediment downstream where it can potentially lead to excess sedimentation elsewhere. Where will that excess sedimentation occur? That leads us sort of to the second question. Can we identify where the rivers are going to be most dynamic? These straightened rivers remain sort of unchanged for decades at times. So this brings me to the second parable of river processes I like to talk about, which is rivers don't like fast changes. They tend to eliminate them. Rivers don't like sharp right angle bends where the water will slow down and the sediment drop out. They like smooth meanders where that sediment can move along relatively consistently. So if you're managing a river and you want to find the problem areas, one thing to do is to look for these fast changes. On the Bear River in New Remain, we can see the original sort of meandering channel taking a sort of just a passing glance at this high riverbank here. But when they straightened the river channel, it created a sharp right angle bend, and it's directly attacking this bank, and the result is severe bank erosion. We see these high eroding banks throughout New England, and they invariably are occurring at a sharp bend where two sort of straightened channels come together. Also, we see this around the country. Another wild and scenic river in Pennsylvania I went to visit, they were wondering why the road washed out at this location, and the reason is it's at a sharp bend where the river had been slightly altered and straightened. So we can sort of link these sort of trouble areas, the dynamic areas, to these fast changes. On the Missisquoi River, we can see a number of sharp bends. These two here look like they might be armored or maybe some erosion. This one in the town of Richford is actually bedrock controlled, so not expected to be dynamic. This one here was freshly armored in 2009. There was armor there before. Maybe decades ago, there was some erosion problems when the road first went in. And so they've armored it to prevent it from eroding. And perhaps it was fortuitous that this armoring occurred just a few years before Tropical Storm Irene, or the old deteriorating armor before they freshened it up might have resulted in troubles in that area. We see the same sharp bends on the Trout River. This is the bend I showed you earlier that's migrated 150 feet as the river tries to soften that bend rather than being so sharp. That erosion makes that bend more open and less sharp. Upstream here, just below the Longley Covered Bridge, I think is the name, you can see that sharp bend was a high eroding bank, which eventually was armored as that erosion, I guess, approached the road. That's one type of fast change where rivers tend to be dynamic. Another one has to do with constrictions in the valley. Here on the Ammonoosuc River in New Hampshire, we can see a very wide floodplain which necks down into a canyon. So we have a valley constriction here, much like sort of an undersized culvert or bridge crossing almost, but at a grander scale. During a flood, with the water spread out across the floodplain, that water cannot instantaneously transition into that narrow canyon. It actually backs up and becomes sort of a pond waiting to let the water pass through the canyon. And so flowing water carries sediment, but ponded water does not. So in this sort of backwater area upstream of the constriction, like the red stars where the photograph is taken, we have a lot of sediment deposited because it's ponding up and the sediment can't keep moving. And the water sort of deflects around that sediment that's accumulating, and we see meanders developing. Notice this is a straightened section of river. This was probably straightened all the way down through the constriction here, but the meander has redeveloped right at the constriction. This is the dynamic area. This is where the change is occurring next to the fast change in width. We see the same thing on the Missisquoi River, just downstream of the confluence with the Trout River. We can see a valley constriction here. These homes are probably built on slightly higher ground, as the contour line suggests. So this isn't quite as dramatic of a constriction, but you can see that meander forming just upstream of the constriction, even though we can see evidence that this channel had been straightened in the past with the channel up against the valley side. So I don't see a whole lot of deposition here. It's not quite as dramatic as the Ammonoosuc River, but it is telling that this meander is developing just upstream of the constriction. We can also see sort of the most dramatic meanders on the Trout River, just upstream of the confluence with the Missisquoi. This is not necessarily a physical constriction. This is what I might call a hydraulic constriction. When the Missisquoi River is flowing high, the Trout River can't sort of flow out into the Missisquoi. It sort of becomes ponded up and deposits sediment and creates this convoluted meander, which has now been cut off on recent aerial photographs. I don't know if it was purposefully straightened or if it naturally sort of cut off that meander. Perhaps someone can let me know after I'm done. These straightened river channels are, in fact, a fast change in themselves. They're sort of an increase in slope along the river where they've straightened it. So these straightened channels themselves are prone to rapid change. Here on the Battenkill in Arlington, Vermont, a log jam formed across a straightened channel, and overnight the river jumped out of the channel at the log jam. These are energetic rivers because they're straightened, and it basically carved a new meander overnight during a single flood. The river migrated 300 feet overnight, started lapping up against the front lawn of this house, potentially threatening the road here. So this is a hazardous condition. These things can happen on these straightened rivers in a single flood. At the same time, they're creating excellent habitat overnight. Now we have a meander bend, different flow velocities along different sections of the river. And so it's sort of a mixed bag, a hazard, but at the same time, improving habitat. We see the same thing on the Trout River. We see the straightened channel configuration on the topo map, but later we see a meander reformed along this straightened section of channel. This was unlikely due to a log jam. I think it was probably due to this tributary pumping sediment out into the river, blocking the river, forcing the river out onto the floodplain and carving a new meander. Some rivers that were straightened have completely reformed their meanders, like the Pulteney River in Fairhaven, Vermont. You wouldn't know that this had been straightened other than the fact that the river is suspiciously up against the valley side. We would expect the river to naturally form anywhere across this very wide floodplain. The fact that it's up against the valley side indicates that it had been straightened in the past, but has completely reformed its meanders. Much like on the Trout River, we can see the river was up against the valley side, but has now completely reformed meanders along its length. Rivers are dynamic, and they do adjust to these human alterations of the channel. It's hard to believe that this nicely sinuous meandering Trout River once had been completely straightened. Over decades, even more than a century, the river has completely rid itself of the straightening and has developed this meandering configuration where sediment can be sort of more evenly distributed along its length. So how do we manage for a river that's sort of dynamic and is going to change? The Trout River was the location of a major restoration project in 2000, just downstream of Montgomery Center. The Vermont River Management Division, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and a number of other agencies did a large-scale restoration project through here. The aerial photographs aren't timed right to capture it, but there was some large floods in the late 90s, which actually had the river sort of cutting this meander off. Then, as part of the restoration, they blocked that side channel and they sort of restored the old meander. The thinking was is that rivers develop meanders over time, and that we're going to restore that meandering configuration as sort of an end member condition. But what was not realized is that end member condition does not stay put, that rivers are dynamic. They are moving sediment and they will change positions over time. So sort of creating the form is not enough. And what happened, as you can see on the photos here, is that even within a year of completion of the restoration project, the river just went back through that side channel area. And zooming in this red box area, you can sort of see the block that they had built across the side channel. And then they built a number of structures in this section of channel to sort of train the river into a single position. What the river management program learned the hard way is the third parable of river processes, that stability does not equal staticness. River stability does not mean the river stays in the same place over time. We have to manage rivers with the ability to change positions over time. And to the river management program's credit, they learned their lesson the hard way hundreds of thousands, if not more than $1 million later. They understood very quickly the lesson learned from the Trout River, that we cannot manage rivers in a static manner. And so they quickly changed the way the river management program was run after that sort of project in early 2000s. And I spoke with Mike Klein. Some of you might know he was, I spoke with him this week to sort of refresh my memory about that project. And he said he was embarrassed, he wouldn't come visit the site for years, but he did want me to stress to this group that this is where Vermont River Management changed the way they did things because of how dynamic the Trout River was. And so what river management is doing even to this day since that point is looking at land conservation along river corridors. I've been doing river corridor mapping in Massachusetts, slightly different technique than Vermont uses perhaps, but with the same goal in mind, trying to identify the area the river needs to migrate over time, what is the area the river is going to sort of migrate over time, and then also highlighting where that migration might be most dynamic due to past straightening or valley constrictions, tributary confluences, things that I've talked about earlier. An ultimate goal of this type of mapping is prioritize areas for land conservation. I was glad to see a website in the watershed, Trout River watershed, that there are corridor easements or conservation easements along the river. This allows the river to migrate without any conflict with infrastructure. We won't feel the need to sort of harden the river in place. We allow the river to migrate freely. And everywhere you're able to do this is taking a little bit of pressure off other areas, maybe other areas where we can't do it. And so the more land is conserved, the sort of the less that energy becomes focused at those sort of fast change locations I was talking about. This is a very slow process. This is something that will take decades to do. This is sort of the priority, is to work towards these conservation easements. In the meantime, you're going to have conflicts. You're going to have to do your bank stabilization projects here and there. But in the background, managing these dynamic rivers is about slowly sort of creating the space for the river to migrate. Since that is decades away, I'll leave you again with the three parables of river processes, which I hope you can use and think about when you're thinking about why is the river being dynamic, where are the most dynamic areas going to be, and what will be the best management approaches to use in the future. Thank you very much.